First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. This is an honor for me. My name's Ricardo Terán. I am a Yale World Fellow here, temporarily here in New Haven at Yale, doing this phenomenal program called the World Fellows Program, which you guys could look up online. And they brought us here to convene with other leaders and practitioners from around the world in different industries, and to kind of come together and use our time at Yale to really network, learn new things about the world, and kind of advance our projects. I am kind of an entrepreneur by birth. I'm the fourth generation of a family business. The connection with Rochester is my grandfather spent a good amount of his young adult life in Rochester at the Rochester Technical Institute. And in 1951, when he was there was basically two big things going on in Rochester, which was Xerox and Kodak. And my family became the first international distributor for the Eastman Kodak company in Latin America. First in X-rays, and then in photography. And to this day, you know, it's kind of my family's core business. So I grew up in Miami because of the Nicaraguan Revolution, the Nicaraguan Civil War, actually. My parents left, you know, thinking they would return a couple of weeks later. A couple of weeks turned into a couple of months. My mother was very pregnant by that point. I ended up being born in Guatemala. And when it was very clear that they weren't going to be able to go back, they tried to find a way to ask for political asylum in Miami. And so I grew up really a great, happy, privileged little league life. And Nicaragua wasn't really part of the psyche, other than the fact that everyone where we lived spoke Spanish and was from Nicaragua, and all the kids we went to school with were kind of the same, but there was also Cubans, Argentines, Colombians, and so it was all a community of Latin people, but we were kind of from Miami. Until 1990, when Violeta Chamorro won the election, and Nicaragua was, you know, went back to democracy, and my grandfather decided to go back to Nicaragua, try to recuperate his assets, his Kodak business, and start over again. And so we moved back to Nicaragua when I started high school in 1993, and after 4 years there and an amazing culture shock later, I came to the U.S. to go to college. I was in Washington, D.C., and luckily, and not by design, kind of by accident, when I came to college, really, truly the first day I got to college, in a conversation I had with someone, it kind of clicked that my time in college needed to be used to gather resources and meet the right kind of people so that one day I could help Nicaragua. And I didn't know exactly what it was, but I kind of felt it. And the logical place for me to start was through business and entrepreneurship. It's what I knew, it's what I did. This makes me sound and feel old, but when I got to college, I mean, Ethernet was just being installed in the dorms. And so I really got into the internet and how it worked, and got into satellite communications, because DC was a hub of satellite communications, met a lot of people there. And long story short, we ended up setting up a satellite internet company in Nicaragua, and most of our customers were rural nonprofits financed by bilateral donors. And when we started installing these internet satellite connections, it was in towns that basically didn't even have phone service because the infrastructure was so bad. So I saw with my own eyes how business could have an impact on development. In this case, we were bringing technology to these communities, and suddenly, not only were we connecting them to the internet, we were connecting them to each other, to diaspora communities who had exiled themselves, but we were also opening them up to all kinds of information that they didn't have access to before, and it completely turned around the way many people live their life. You guys have heard the stories of technology in African villages, that through SMS they can get prices in the next village, and so information asymmetries come down. I mean, those are very real success stories. And one of the areas that was most successful was when we connected these people, starting to feed education programs through the internet. Very simple, text-based, just information. And so after I started that company, through my family business, I was a sophomore in college. We programmed the first internet portal in Nicaragua, to try and get local content online. And is when I started saying, you know what, this could be much bigger than the internet company. This could be, how can I use business to have an impact on development? I became very passionate about it. I started meeting people and interning at the World Bank, at the Inter-American Development Bank, getting myself into any kind of conference or after hours conversation with anybody in the field that would talk to me and would give me knowledge. And it proved invaluable, because today that I have the nonprofit and all these efforts, a lot of these people have come back into the picture and are key actors in helping us move forward. I ended up doing my master's degree in international development combined with a business degree, and decided to move back to Nicaragua in 2006. I was involved with the government of the time, the president of the time, from the point of view that I was very sympathetic to their views. It was a businessman who had a long-term vision for Nicaragua. For the first time in my lifetime, I felt there was a plan. It was a very well thought out plan. Everybody from Michael Porter to local labor unions had kind of contributed to this country plan. Politics ultimately destroyed the plan. And although I think he was a very successful president from the economics point of view, with all the indicators looking up, and most importantly, the Central American Free Trade Agreement being signed, I don't know how history is going to judge that period of time because of the politics.
Which period exactly?
2002 to 2006. Bolaños. And ultimately, you know, President Bolaños, upon leaving, the government passes back to the Sandinistas, who, in my opinion, had a road paved with gold. They could have really taken the country in just a spectacular growth path because of what had been set up. The free trade agreements, the growth rates that were coming, the efforts in education that had been made, with all the problems that were there. But kind of one of the biggest opportunities was the foreign direct investment climate. I mean, in 2002, foreign direct investment was less than 100 million a year. I mean, drop in the bucket, right? 100 million is like what, you know, one of Toys R Us or something sells in a day. 100 million to almost 300 million. You know, and then today, even though official statistics say that the levels are relative, they're really, you really need to understand the numbers to know that that's not really true. It's basically one humongous energy project investment that's making up all the numbers. But a lot of the foreign direct investment has really come down. But since 2002 that I moved back to Nicaragua, I got involved with the government because I was kind of sympathetic, but actually they gave me a great opportunity because they asked me to represent Nicaragua in Spain in the creation of an association of young entrepreneurs. I spent a month and a half in Spain, and when we got back, we formed an association of young entrepreneurs. And we knew that the people who helped found the association were entrepreneurs running their own businesses, and we knew that connecting people was a valuable thing, and we knew that there was a lot of business opportunities, but we didn't know exactly how to capture them. But what we were not prepared for was the tidal wave of interest from young people in the country, particularly people who were in universities. And when you look at the numbers, over 70% of the population is under 30 years old. So you have a ticking time bomb where if these people don't find jobs, you're going to have a bad situation, but actually you have, you know, this huge opportunity to get talent, energy, you know, network connected young people at universities building their own businesses. We had over 10,000 university students requesting information, interest in starting their own business, lectures, courses. It was completely overwhelming. And we had really no money to do this. It was just on our spare time. That gave way to Agora partnerships, which I'll leave for you guys. And we started Agora with a joint collaboration with who is now my business partner and one of my best friends, who was Ben Powell. And Ben was at Columbia Business School at the time. And there was an idea of, could we help all these people who have all this entrepreneurial talent could we really help take them from a business plan to reality, knowing all the difficulties that entrepreneurship has inherent in itself. You guys know the fatality numbers of new businesses, even here in the U.S., are very, very high. Very few businesses survive more than 2 or 3 years. New businesses survive more than 2 or 3 years. So we used the time that Ben had at Columbia Business School to incubate the idea. And we started taking entrepreneurs that we knew through the Association of Young Entrepreneurs and started consulting to them on their business plan, using Columbia Business School students and students from Georgetown University, which was my alma mater, to give their time during school, people who had experience in the real world, while now that they were in their MBA, to help take this business plan to an execution plan. If you've ever seen or written a business plan, you know that many times it's very theoretical, but we said, what are the steps that we need to take to make this happen? Like very concrete execution plans, very real world financial modeling, which is a skill that not all the entrepreneurs had. And what we found was there was an enormous amount of not just talent that stayed on the sideline, but missed opportunities for Nicaragua to be creating jobs and to be bringing new products and services to the market, many of them geared to the bottom of the pyramid. We also found a bunch of people coming from outside of the capital, from some of the semi-urban towns across Nicaragua, with real good ideas that we thought could come to fruition. So on top of bringing the consulting piece to the table and helping these people take it towards execution, there was 2 other elements that are crucial to any business to really help them start up, grow, and survive the growth, and then kind of take it to the next level. One is networks, access to networks, and the other is access to finance. Access to networks we take for granted because we do it all the time. The American culture in particular is geared towards networking, clubs, fraternities, just living together in dorms, and meeting the people in your dorm. And now with Facebook, etc., we are interconnected in ways that we don't even think about. But in developing countries, building networks basically means family, friends, community. And you need a lot more. You need to bring in outside perspectives to really grow the business. So what we did is we opened our Rolodex to these people. So if you had a fruit processing facility, could we get you a meeting with the Association of Hotels in Nicaragua so that you could talk to a whole group of people that is outside of your network, but that is crucial for your business to grow if that's your target market. Pretty simple stuff. In terms of access to capital, as you guys can imagine and know, and all the reports and studies and even the evidence of microfinance is that, access to capital in developing countries is probably the #1, well, it's been said to be the #1 barrier to entry for new businesses and for small businesses to grow. I have a little bit of, now that I know what I know, I have a little bit of reservation because it's one of the main ones, but I'm not sure if it's the main one, and I can explain to you guys a little bit later why I think that. But nonetheless, it's all basically asset-backed financing, commercial lending. And if you don't already have the assets, and if basically you're not already creditworthy, you can't get any credit. It's kind of a circular argument that sometimes doesn't really make sense. You need more jobs, you need a more dynamic economy, you need entrepreneurs, but there's no financing because they're not already kind of in. They don't already have this asset base, etc. And microfinance, I think, brought a level of capital to the market that now that we look at the evidence, has been highly successful in helping people move from subsistence to kind of, at least on a individual and family scale to a little bit more than subsistence. But if you look at what microfinance is used for, microfinance is not really used to grow businesses. Okay? It's not used to build scale. It's used to complement the family's activities in business. So if your house has, leaks and your floor floods, not only does it affect the family, it affects the business because inside of the house is where you do your things. So we said, well, microfinance has brought all this capital to the market. How do we go to the next stage of microfinance and give access to capital to people with talent, with the right kind of background to execute these business plans, where our network can complement what these guys are doing, and then give the right kind of capital to be able to scale. And what we saw that capital to be was about, anywhere from $25,000 to $250,000, which is where you need to be to kind of try and get to a level where you can really gauge, is this business long term or is this business not going to survive? And what are the models out there to kind of get that capital to people? Well, the venture capital model is what we saw as the closest model to try and get very highly risky capital that aligns the interests of entrepreneur and investor. And so we started raising a micro venture capital fund, a micro equity fund that was beyond microfinance to serve customers that are in this missing middle. And the missing middle is basically the people that are too large for microfinance, but not big enough or established enough that they are already in commercial banking. And so there's a lot of keys for this model to work. And there was a lot of things that were that didn't make sense with microequity. And it's one of the reasons it had never started before. And one of the fundamental principles is that it's just as expensive to manage small amounts of money as it is to manage large amounts of money. That's why the smallest venture capital funds are 20, 30, 40, 50 million dollars. We were attempting to raise a fund that was $2 million with investments in between $25,000 and $250,000. And actually, because of the target market that we were reaching, where not all the networks were created, not all the management team had the kind of skills that you needed to really grow the business, they actually needed much more help than actually bigger deals. So we were doing smaller deals where there's not that many economies of scale, and the cost of doing those deals was much, much higher. Because of the interventions we needed to make to help the business grow. And also just the transaction costs that are necessary to close a deal. What transaction costs? All the legal fees. If you're paying a lawyer and you're doing all the paperwork for $2,500 to close a deal for $20 million, well, it's $2,500 for a $25,000 deal. That's 10% of the deal. So all these scale issues and all these problems were things that we needed to overcome, and we tried to overcome with our model. We had a lot of success with our consulting programs. We had a lot of success helping people build their business plans and turn them into execution plans. We've had a lot of success connecting entrepreneurs. Actually, over the last 5 years, we've helped over 4,000 entrepreneurs in Nicaragua. We did that with the help of great partners like USAID, like the Rockefeller Foundation, like the Kellogg Foundation, Draper Richards Foundation, etc. And the fund that we raised, I think, has had mixed results from the financial point of view, but great results from the learning point of view. Because one of the main focuses of the fund was, well, could we bring the access to knowledge through consulting, networks, through our connections, and capital through this fund? Could we bring access to knowledge, networks, and capital to these missing middle entrepreneurs and help them really grow their businesses and have these businesses have a social impact? And that was a crux. Could we use entrepreneurship to have a social impact? Could we use entrepreneurship as a driver of development? Could we use entrepreneurship as a keystone of economic and social development policy? And not just think of entrepreneurship in the same breath as, savage capitalism, unbridled, profit maximizing capitalism. And so the fund was making a certain profile of investments, and I think a lot of the issues that I talked about in terms of the problems and the scale were present. And it meant that a lot of our deals were very difficult to find financial success. But in the end, I'm not sure our fund is going to, in terms of successful and unsuccessful financial deals, will do that different than a traditional venture capital fund, where maybe only 10% of the deals do very, very well. One of the keys to that success-failure ratio is understanding how the economics of the venture capital funds work. if a fund has, let's say, a Google in it, or an Amazon, or, you know, another kind of company like that, and that's the one or that's the one company that's successful, and all the other companies fail. When these companies go to the IPO market to raise money, they wipe out all the failures because you made so much money on that one deal, right? Are you guys following that? In our kind of funds, impact investing funds, funds that seek to invest in entrepreneurs that can grow a scalable business and also have social impact. If 10% or 20% of the fund is successful, you have to have exited, you have to have received your money back in a period of time from companies who maybe will be able to return 15, 20, 30, 40% returns over the life of their fund. And if all the other companies are wiped out, those successful companies won't be able to cover all the other companies. So it's really a question of the economics and the logistics of how the funds and how these fund structures work. So now we're kind of moving on. We've learned our lessons. We're creating new programs and projects. There's been a flood of impact investor money coming into the market, primarily because of the success of microfinance and the flooding of the international capital markets with money for microfinance. And we could talk about that. So a lot of the original microfinance investors are now moving into impact investment and trying to hit this missing middle. And so our newest project, which is basically underway and it officially launches January 15th, basically when you guys are there, you guys are going to see all this, is to try and really identify the kind of companies that we can help connect to all this capital that already exists. When we started, 6 years ago, the capital really didn't exist. Now much more capital exists. So we might not have to do all the hard work on both helping these companies become investor ready and making our own bets. We're actually trying to connect a lot of these people, and that's the Agora Accelerator Program. And this Accelerator Program, I think, is going to have a huge opportunity to make a dent in this kind of supply chain, because one of the most difficult things to achieve for investors and entrepreneurs in the developing world to get together is high transaction costs, which we already talked about, and identifying, going out and actually finding these deals. Those things are expensive for the investor and for the entrepreneur. And it's really an information and coordination problem to a large extent. But it also has to do with trust, because in a lot of developing countries, trust isn't not trusting each other is a big issue in society. Everybody tries to kind of get on top of the next guy. And when you have foreigners, come in and wanting to give capital, who are these people? They want to take part of my business. They say they want to help, but, development projects fail all the time. And I think Agora Partnerships has established a great brand of trust where we can create a safe middle ground for people to come together and really try and get deals done and kind of give our, kind of credence and support to helping the entrepreneur really grow his business, while also telling the investor, we've already done A, B, C, D, E kind of due diligence, and we think this is the real deal. I will stop there so we can leave at least half an hour for a Q&A. I can talk about basically almost anything that you guys want, which is dangerous. But that was kind of a quick take on what is Agora Partnerships and kind of the views of trying to create social entrepreneurship and impact investing in development. So I will open it up to you guys.
What is the education there like for the general population? How educated are you?
So education is, now it's almost, sadly a cliche because everybody needs education, right? But it's a very long-term investment in a society for it to produce results. And education is complicated. It's not just education. It's teachers, infrastructure, content, etc. Nicaragua has a very particular education situation because the Constitution of Nicaragua mandates that 6% of our budget goes to universities. So Nicaragua only has about 100,000 university students, but on average, they're there more than, I think, 5.5 or 6 years. And what is spent per university students per year in public education is more than $1,000 per student. Yet Nicaragua has over 1 million school-aged children, particularly elementary students. And over 800,000 school-aged children are outside of the system.
How much?
800,000. And what is being spent per child is less than $80. And so I think there's a fundamental structural problem in that relationship, because elementary education is elementary. It's the basis for all future growth in education. And there's a lot of politics behind that. You know, there's also just basic mismanagement of resources. I think technology is a huge opportunity to kind of turn that around. Obviously, you see less attendance, higher dropouts, less coverage in many rural areas, and Nicaragua still has an important amount of rural population. I don't know the latest figures, but it has to be close, if not above 50%. Nicaragua, like most countries in the world, developing and developed, has had a significant shift to urban areas, right, like other countries in the world, but it's still highly rural. Girls still have less education kind of than boys, which, you know, if you said you have one shot, one investment to make in development in the next 30 years and only one, you know, there's a gazillion, but I would say it's education for girls, which is, you know, I think not a doubt the highest return on investment that you can find for development is having educated women. They manage money. They've shown to manage money better. They take care of families in a different way, especially in a place like Nicaragua. We have a very maternalistic society. Lots of women are heads of households, not men. So investing in women, I think, would be one of the keys to kind of solving that problem. The Sandinista government, which is the government that's in right now, has a big vocation towards education policy. And they've tried to do a lot of educational policy reform. But as you can see in this country, that's not an easy formula to get. I mean, should it be more determined by the states and the communities or by the federal government? What's the involvement of parents? How much more involved should they get? How much you invest in infrastructure versus educating versus teachers? How do you deal with teachers' unions? And how do you deal with performance of those teachers? So there's a lot of issues that we need to work on. The way that I saw it, and I was actually, you know, my focus in development, even though I was in this technology company, was really through the education front. And kind of why I shifted most of my time into entrepreneurship was because of the realization that the education investment is necessary. It's incredibly complex and has a lot of moving parts, and it really takes a long time to show results. And entrepreneurship, it's kind of a little bit more immediate. So if we could have a balanced kind of equation on entrepreneurship plus a long-term focus on education, I think this is the right path. So the ultimate issue is, what is society's kind of focus and desire? Our Central American societies are very government dependent. It's a very, not paternalistic, but kind of patronage point of view. The government has to kind of help. The government hasn't done this, or the government did that, and because of that, this happened to me. It's very government-centered. And I think that we need to make it more, you know, citizen-centered, more about us. You know, you're on one side of the political aisle, you're on the other side of the political aisle. We need to come together on certain things like education. This obviously sounds so silly when you say it, because if you just read the newspaper, even about the United States, you know, every country in the world, I think right now, is having problems getting together. But in general, the United States still has a vision as a society. We move forward as a society because we're all searching for a better life, the American dream, et cetera, et cetera. I think in places like Nicaragua, that still has not happened, in part because of economic inequalities. The top 10% of Nicaragua's population versus the bottom 20% of Nicaragua's population is just completely extreme in terms of income distribution, access to educational opportunities, obviously. So it's not an easy problem to solve, and the current picture is not a pretty one.
So, what is their attitude to technology and education? Do you think it's something that they're into and they feel like it's actually going to improve their lives, or are they more focused
they
on,
is who like ordinary citizens or the government?
Citizens, the ordinary citizens.
Yeah, technology is not just information and communications technology. I mean, it's not just iPhones and internet. It's about how delivering content, for example. And I think it's kind of part of human nature that when you have new things, sometimes there's resistance, but there are proven systems, methods, methodologies to kind of that use technology more effectively. And I think most people would adopt them. So it's actually simpler than that. It's in many cases, particularly rural areas, particularly girls, a cultural thing. Does it really make sense to send my kids to school? What do they produce for my family? I didn't go to school, and look at me. I'm not rich, but we're surviving. And I need all these kids to kind of help me work. I think that's a cultural attitude that's present in a lot of developing countries. I think it's diminishing. I think more and more people are really understanding the importance of educating their kids, even if they don't produce all the time with the family. But it's a combination. It's also an economics question. To me, there's a lot of very old school thinking about education that is plain wrong. I, of course, could also be wrong, but well, we don't have access to textbooks, and buying all these textbooks costs X. And so we only have Y, and so we'll buy the cheapest textbook that's 30 years old, and even then we won't distribute it to everybody. If you look at the amount of money that it would cost to negotiate with an OEM manufacturer, basically the people who make the iPads, just an example, I guarantee you we could find iPad-like devices for $150, and we can put all the newest content for less than 5% of the cost of buying textbooks. And then you say, well, iPads need to get recharged. What about electricity? And then you'll find 1,000 reasons why not to do it. But I could probably counter with 1,000 reasons why you should do it, and how much higher return that iPad investment will have for the people receiving the education. So there's a lot. So it really comes down to how the argument is presented and where you want to kind of invest your money. If you want to try and reach all 800,000 kids out of the system all at once from night to day, there's probably no reasonable way to do it. If you already have 800,000 other children who are part of the system, and of those 200,000 have access to basic infrastructure with electricity, running water, et cetera, if you do a pilot program of even 2,000, those 2,000 are going to have an amazing opportunity, right? And what do you do with the other 798,000 who don't have access to this opportunity? I'm not exactly sure, but giving all 800,000 equal access to bad education, I don't know if that's better. So it's not a right position, it's not a wrong position. It's let's think these through, let's bring partners to the table to help us. My family, business is Kodak, but it's also partnerships with we're official partners with Dell, we're official partners with Canon, with Microsoft, with Oracle. We've done, a huge part of our business is in education, and it's with the government. The government actually has made significant investments in technology across the board, not just education. And you see some of these pilot programs, and then even some of the programs that scale, and there's a lot of reasons why to be excited. And it's not just, again, about information and communications technologies. I'll close with an experiment kind of done in Costa Rica, and of course, the name just slipped my mind, but I'll remember it. Started by President Figueres and the MIT Media Lab, bringing old 40-ton containers to rural villages and setting up little technology classrooms in there. Was highly successful. And then in Mexico, you have over 500,000 middle school children that receive an important part of their curriculum through a closed television circuit that's transmitted from the central government. So it's distance learning, and that's been highly effective. For every effective technology project, we've seen other ineffective ones, but it's a deep issue, and I think it's an area where we need to focus more energy and attention on, because every minute and every dollar invested in that path, to me, is much more productive than invested in other paths when it comes to education.
Can you please explain why over 70% of the population is very young? Why is this?
I mean, I don't know if I can explain why, but there was a very high birth rate. There was a huge amount of migration out of Nicaragua of working age people. Since 1970, between 1972 and 1990, between earthquakes and wars, there was percentage-wise an important amount of the population that didn't exist anymore. So, you know, you have, and then of course, you know, poverty is pretty closely correlated with large families. Less so today. I mean, even in 2002, I think the growth rate was almost 3% a year. And when your economy is growing at 3% or less a year, everybody's getting poorer every year. I was actually surprised that the growth rate of the last couple of years has been much closer to 2%. I mean, 1 percentage point doesn't sound like a lot, but it actually is a lot. And in such a short amount of time. And this phenomenon is happening in many places. If you break it down between rural, urban, between poor and rich, you see starker contrasts. But, you know, there's a lot of things that are going to that are going to trend in the medium term, I think, towards lower number of people per family. You know, and then a lot of people just, you know, they use their children as workforce, and so they started having lots of kids in the 80s and early 90s. And so I think this is why you see a burgeoning of young people. There's about 100,000 new jobs need to be created a year just to support the new entrants into the workforce. And the year we created the most amount of jobs over the last 20 years was during Enrique Bolaños' period, where there was about 72,000 new jobs. 2009 resulted in a net loss of jobs. And that doesn't even count underemployment, where people are not only informal, but underpaid. So the informal economy, where people don't pay taxes, where people don't pay labor benefits or anything like this, is at least as big and probably bigger than the formal economy. And so this is significant when you're looking at population trends and when you're looking at employment trends and how these two fit together.
Now these guys, when they're down here, will hear some big people starting talking about the effect that Chavez has had in terms of all his money. Can you talk a bit about that? Because I kind of watch him forming a shadow government, if you will, or another locus of power, at least, outside the democratic process. I'd like to know if you have any perspectives on the money that Chavez is giving and what it's causing, and how is it helping? And
well, you know, I'll give a couple.
I suspect that it's not. That it's being.
Yeah, I mean, just a couple of facts. I mean, officially, the development assistance from Venezuela to Nicaragua, it's called development assistance. It's arguable what constitutes development assistance in this case, has been about $500 million a year. It's not going into the federal budget. It's being kept outside in private corporations that are basically getting this money as a kickback from Nicaragua buying oil from Venezuela, right? If this money were going into the budget, it would easily represent at least 25% of the budget. It's humongous, okay? And last I heard, 2008, I think it was almost 40% of the budget was total development assistance. So if you add this to what already was, you're easily looking at, you can gather the magnitude of $500 million a year. Now, because it's not going into the federal budget, it's not regulated. And so this has been the direct promise of Chavez and Ortega to the people, that this money would be used for development assistance. There's not a lot of information out there as to where this money is going and how it's being used. There's a lot of speculation on both sides. There's a lot of very direct social programs that were begun in Ortega's first year that supposedly a lot of this money was being used. There's been a lot of promises made with that money, so that new refineries, new energy projects, new infrastructure, and a lot of that physically has not materialized. I'm not speculating, I'm giving you facts, because, you know, I can give you a ton of opinions, but I don't know how valid they are. So I think it has shifted the landscape significantly in terms of politics. One is Nicaragua going down a path of, you know, 21st century socialism, and are we going to be part of that group, and what does that mean from the national perspective and from the international perspective? So far, I haven't seen any results, this is me talking, any results that overwhelmingly convince us to show support for that kind of project. From the international front looking in, I think it's very annoying for countries like the United States and a lot of the European countries. Europeans being much more liberal, much more socially minded than the United States, and they're finding it very annoying, to use a term lightly. And there seems to also be an important, there doesn't seem to be. The fact is, there has been an enormous amount of empowerment to the people who have access to this money. And what it seems like is that the people who have access to this money is Ortega and a small group of people around him, not even the entire, you know, Sandinista machinery. But it is fair to contrast that with saying that Venezuela has done such a great job of destroying its own productive industries. Venezuela cannot even produce they can't even produce milk enough to supply their people. So that there are businesses in Nicaragua that, because they're part of this pact, are exporting to Venezuela. So there are private sector actors that are also benefiting, not from that $500 million, but from the relationship with Venezuela. You know, is that kind of, there's a term they use in Nicaragua called confites en el infierno, kind of candy and it's like a temptation. I don't know if that kind of temptation is macro-wise offsets the other distortions that has brought. But I'm trying to be as balanced as possible, giving you both sides.
Being very fair.
Yeah. It's hard to do.
I think in the long run, I think Nicaragua needs to understand that it's not Venezuela, that money will run out. Venezuela has an enormous amount of oil to back that up. Nicaragua doesn't. Nicaragua is part of a Central American community that as a region has a huge opportunity to grow, as individual countries have very opportunity to be competitive. And by looking to the south, which is a great new market, but not being part of any other regional initiative in any significant way, the costs outweigh the benefits of that strategy. And by empowering this small group of people, I think it's led them to the false conclusion, but highly calculated on their part, that, you know, maybe not all the rules of the game are fair, so that they may need to change them to continue this project of empowering the people. One of them being, many of them being against the Constitution. And that is directly in line with how Chavez has worked in Venezuela. For him, the goal has been social empowerment, social inclusion, and equality. And social empowerment, I think in Venezuela has happened to a certain extent. Social inclusion, I'm not sure. And equality has definitely not happened. So I don't see why it would be successful in Nicaragua. And in the meantime, these empowered people, through these enormous amounts of money, have very significantly attacked and deteriorated fundamental cornerstones of institutions of not only any democracy, but of our particular kind of democracy, which is young and fragile anyway. So the net result, facts, I think, state that this is not the kind of track that we need to be on as a country or as a government. The other fact is, opposing this has found a much weaker voice than you would think. And that is in part because of petty politics. That is in part because of long-standing political traditions in places like Nicaragua, where small groups of individuals play outsized roles. And the net result has been that today over 70%, that's not true, over 60% of Nicaragua's electorate doesn't identify with any form of political party or any one philosophy. So there's just complete disunion. So the only bloc that remains kind of true is the left. Within the left, there's a small group of people being empowered. What is that going to do for the left in general, I think, is a question mark. But those are my perspectives and facts. And we can talk offline later about other things.
I'm going to send you guys also, and this might be kind of confusing when it gets down to politics and, you know, talking about the different parties. I'm going to send out a couple books that I would recommend that maybe you read, and, you know, I know that it's finals, and so maybe, well, you know, a few weeks during Christmas break when you have off, I'll send you guys out a couple reading lists that might give you a better idea and a little bit more context about what he was talking about as far as the government and the politics. So I'll send that out.
I highly, highly, highly recommend a book on Nicaragua written by a New York Times reporter, Stephen Kinzer, called Blood of Brothers.
That's what I was going to send out.
It is, I actually just read it. I have been trying to get my hands on it for a long time, and I hadn't been able to find it. When I got here to Yale, they had it in their library. And it's a phenomenal book.
And then I've also been working on a documentary for the past year about the history of Nicaragua, where we interviewed Stephen Kinzer, and we're going to be debuting it in January when you guys are all there, so you'll also get a chance to watch that as well. So we're going to be showing it while we're down there.
I'd love to see that.
Yeah, well, we'll invite you definitely. So.
I'm thinking he might be a good one to see it, like.
Well, that's what I told him.
Now.
I told you yesterday. I said maybe we can see him do it. So we
Right,
can talk
now, now not being necessarily today, but.
Yeah, there's a professor at Yale who's been teaching kind of revolutionary Latin America for a long time.
He's on our board.
Gil Joseph?
Yeah, he's on our board.
Yeah.
On our honorary board.
Yeah, so we did a class together, and you know, one of his students is doing an incredibly interesting paper on the role of the private sector during the revolution, and we've actually we've managed to get about 10 incredibly key interviews with key players during the revolution, and he's coming to Nicaragua in 2 weeks. And we're going to do interviews with these people. I mean, people who were the generals of the Sandinista Revolution, people who were part of the group of 12 private sector people before the Somoza government falls. I mean, we have interviews with these people, and there's going to be this paper that I hope is going to be published at the end of next year. So, and I think it's going to be very interesting. There's this kind of resurgent interest in Nicaraguan history. For the first time, historical accounts of the revolution from revolutionaries are really starting to come out. And I think it's very interesting because, you know, Ortega uses the word reconciliation and peace as a kind of punchline. I truly believe that we need a reconciliation as a society, and it's still very near and dear to our hearts. But you almost condemn anybody who's 40 years old and up who is still living in the country. You almost condemn them to the sideline because the emotions are so charged. And so my personal opinion is when Don Enrique Bolaños came in, where it's finally where the kind of lost generation of the 80s was starting to come to age and make an influence and a change in the country, they really set, there was a lot of people who came back to live to Nicaragua, started the country on a kind of growth path. Now that it's not the Sandinistas' fault, but now that there's this new government and the world financial crisis and all these other things, a lot of people are starting to leave again. It seems like we're replaying the same video, very closely related to what happened, you know, in the late 70s before the revolution started. This is not a prediction that there will be another revolution, by no means, but you're starting to see a very scary repetition of very recent history. And I think that's why there's this resurgence of interest in studying Nicaraguan history, because I think other people are feeling it too. And all these books and interviews and documentaries, to me, help in this reconciliation process.
Well, we had some of the interviews that we had Aiden Pastora, we had Stephen Kinzer, we interviewed Jay Condobelli, we interviewed Felix Medellín, so we have kind of an interesting perspective. And plus we have, I think, about 7 Sandinista veterans, 4 Contra veterans, some that were originally Sandinista, then went to Contra, and then went to that, like Pastora. So
one of those Contra leaders is now believed to be the hope of the disunified anti-Sandinista bloc, which today represents about 50 to 60% of the voters, that he may be a person to unify and win the election. Of course, I'm blanking out in front of the camera. But Gadea, Fabio Gadea, who is the owner of Radio Corporación, who has no political experience from what I can tell, but has been kind of so far the person that people are looking to.
I know it's 11 o'clock.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
I hope this was interesting to you guys, and I am going to leave these with you. If you could do me the favor of handing them out to everybody here on campus that you think might be interested. And thank you so much for the opportunity for coming.
Thank you.